The dinner table went completely silent the moment it happened. Not the polite kind of silence that falls over a room when someone says something awkward. The deep, airless kind that only arrives when something occurs that cannot be taken back, cannot be explained away, and cannot be pretended out of existence, no matter how badly everyone present wishes it could be. My father's hand came across the table so fast that for a full second, I genuinely could not process what I had just witnessed. Then I looked at my wife. Sarah was sitting completely still, her hand pressed against her cheek, her eyes wide, not from the pain, though there was pain, but from the particular shock of a person who has just been shown something about the world they were not prepared to see. The table was full. My sister, my brother-in-law, my aunt, my two nephews, my mother. Every single one of them frozen. Every single one of them looking at me. Because that is what this family has always done in moments of crisis. They look at me. I am the one who fixes things. I have been the one who fixes things for 31 years. That night, I finally understood what that role had actually been costing me. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 44 years old, and I have lived in Cincinnati, Ohio my entire life, in the same general neighborhood where I was born, raised, and shaped into the specific kind of man that a specific kind of family requires when there is a specific kind of father at the center of it. I work in commercial insurance. Nothing dramatic, the kind of career that pays reliably and asks nothing of you beyond competence and consistency, which suited me perfectly because everything dramatic in my life has always happened at home rather than at work. I married Sarah 11 years ago in a small ceremony at a garden venue outside the city, and from the day I introduced her to my family, I understood that there was going to be a negotiation required between the life I was building with her and the life my family expected me to remain inside. I had been managing that negotiation quietly and alone for 11 years. Christmas Day was the day it ended. Let me tell you about my father before I tell you what he did, because a man does not arrive at the moment of striking his daughter-in-law across a Christmas dinner table without a long road of smaller moments preceding it. His name is Frank Mercer. He is 71 years old, a retired electrician who worked for the same company for 34 years and wore that loyalty like a medal he expected everyone around him to acknowledge regularly. He is not a stupid man. He is not, in the ways that are easy to point to, a cruel man. He is something more complicated and in some ways more difficult than either of those things. He is a man who has spent his entire life confusing control with love and who has never, not once in 7 decades on this earth, been made to understand the difference between the two. I say this not to excuse him. I say it because understanding it took me 31 years, and I think you need to understand it too before the rest of this story makes complete sense. Growing up with Frank Mercer meant growing up in a house where the temperature of every room was determined by his mood when he walked into it. On good days, and there were genuinely good days, I want to be honest about that, he was funny and generous and the kind of father who showed up to every baseball game and knew every one of my teammates by name. On bad days, which came without forecast and departed without apology, the house became something you navigated carefully, the way you navigate a room in the dark, moving slowly and staying close to the walls and hoping nothing you touched made a sound that drew attention. My mother learned this navigation early in their marriage and never stopped practicing it. My sister Karen learned it too, though she eventually moved to Denver and put 1,500 miles between herself and the requirement. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who got good at the navigation, so good that it eventually stopped feeling like something I was doing and started feeling like simply who I was. I became the family's emotional infrastructure before I was old enough to have a word for what that meant. When my father's temper flared at my mother, I was the one who redirected the conversation, made a joke, found a reason to change the subject before things escalated past the point of easy return. When family gatherings threatened to collapse under the weight of my father's opinions delivered without invitation or restraint, I was the one who smoothed and managed and quietly absorbed the friction so that everyone else could continue having the version of a normal family they all needed to believe in. I was good at it, genuinely good. And the terrible thing about being genuinely good at something is that the people who benefit from it never develop the incentive to ask whether the cost of it is fair. My family never asked. Not once. They simply relied on the mechanism I provided and called it love. And for a long time, I called it love too, because I didn't have another name for it. Sarah saw it immediately. That is one of the things I love most about her. She sees the actual shape of things rather than the version of them people have agreed to present. On our third date, she asked me why I never disagreed with anyone, even when I clearly thought they were wrong. I laughed it off. She didn't push, but she filed it away, the way she files things, carefully and without expiration date. Over the years of our relationship, she gently, consistently, pointed at the pattern every time it manifested. The phone calls I took from my father 11 at night, and spent an hour managing him back to calm. The family dinners I spent navigating rather than attending. The version of myself I visibly became in my parent house that was smaller and more careful than the man she knew everywhere else. She never issued ultimatums. She never demanded I choose. She simply kept reflecting the truth back to me, patiently, year after year, waiting for the day I was ready to actually look at it. The tension between Sarah and my father had been building for years before Christmas, gathering the way weather gathers, slowly and then all at once. It was never one large thing. It was the accumulation of small things. The comments he made about her cooking when she brought dishes to family dinners, the way he interrupted her in conversations and then looked at me to confirm whatever he'd just said, the Christmas 2 years earlier when he'd told her that women who didn't want children were selfish. Not knowing or perhaps not caring that Sarah and I had been through 2 miscarriages and made a painful private decision together about our family's future. I had handled that moment the way I handled every moment. A smooth redirect, a subject change, a quiet apology to Sarah later in the car that she accepted with a grace she shouldn't have had to exercise. I had never addressed it with my father. I had never addressed any of it with my father, and silence, I was about to learn, is not the same thing as resolution. This past Christmas, there were 9 of us at my parents' house. My parents, Karen, and her husband Mike, who'd flown in from Denver, my Aunt Patricia, my 2 nephews aged 8 and 11, Sarah, and me. The day started well enough. The way days that end badly often do, the pleasant surface holding until something underneath finally gives. We were at the dinner table, food passed, and plates full. The particular warmth of the house at Christmas doing what it always does, softening edges and making things feel temporarily simpler than they are. My father had been drinking since noon, which was not unusual for holidays, and which everyone at that table had already quietly noted and internally calibrated for the way we always calibrated for it. The conversation turned to politics, which it should not have, which it always did, and within 10 minutes my father was saying things that were wrong, and my family was doing what it always did, nodding along or finding reasons to look at their plates. Sarah disagreed with him. That was all. She disagreed with something he said, calmly and clearly, the way an intelligent adult disagrees with another intelligent adult in a conversation, with her actual opinion, stated without malice, supported with reasoning. I saw it happening and felt the familiar internal alarm activate, the one that had been wired into me over 3 decades of managing my father in exactly these moments. I reached for my water glass, preparing to redirect, scanning the table for the conversational exit I would need in approximately 15 seconds. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the clarity of Sarah's voice. Maybe it was the simple dignity of watching my wife treat my father like a person capable of handling disagreement rather than a force of nature to be managed around. Maybe I was just tired in a way that had been accumulating for 31 years and had finally reached the only level that produces actual change. I stopped reaching for the redirect. I let Sarah speak, and my father's hand came across the table. Time does a strange thing in moments of violence. It doesn't slow down the way movies suggest. It stutters, skipping frames, leaving gaps between instants that your brain later tries to fill with logic that wasn't available in real time. One frame my father was speaking, his voice raised to the particular pitch that I knew meant he felt cornered. The next frame his hand was moving. The next frame Sarah's head had moved with it. The next frame the room was silent and her hand was against her cheek, and my father was sitting back in his chair with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not remorse, not shock at his own action, but something closer to the look of a man who has just demonstrated something he considers conclusive. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds ended 31 years of something I had built my entire identity around, though I didn't have the words for that yet. All I had in that moment was the sight of my wife's hand against her cheek and 9 people looking at me to fix it. I did not fix it. I want to be clear about what happened instead, because I have told this story to a small number of people since Christmas, and several of them expected me to describe a dramatic confrontation, raise voices, something cinematic and cathartic. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more devastating. I put down my fork. I looked at my father for a long moment without saying anything, long enough that the silence itself communicated something that words would have made smaller. Then I looked at Sarah. "Do you want to leave?" I asked her. Just that. No speech, no confrontation, no management of the room or the feelings of the 9 people in it. Just a question directed at my wife, placing her comfort above everything else in that house for the first time in 11 years of attending family events together. She looked at me, and something moved in her expression that I had never seen there before, something between relief and grief. "Yes," she said quietly. We left. We drove home in almost complete silence. Sarah sat in the passenger seat with her hand still occasionally touching her cheek, not because it hurt significantly. It had been more shock than force, but the way you touch something after it's been struck, checking it, confirming it, processing through your fingertips what your mind hasn't fully accepted yet. I drove, and I didn't speak because I was doing something I had very rarely allowed myself to do in relation to my father, which was feel the actual unmanaged weight of what had just occurred without immediately moving to minimize or contextualize or redirect it. It was enormous. It sat in that car between us and took up all the available air. We got home, changed out of our Christmas clothes, and Sarah made tea. And we sat at our kitchen table, and I told her something I had never said out loud to another person in 31 years of navigating my family. "I'm sorry it took me this long," I told her. "You should never have had to wait this long for me to see it." She cried then. And I need to tell you something about Sarah's crying because it matters to the full understanding of that moment. Sarah is not a person who cries easily or frequently. She is steady in a way that runs bone deep. The kind of steady that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from years of having learned to carry feeling without being overcome by it. When she cries, it means something has bypassed every defense she's built. Something has reached the part of her that doesn't have a composed response available. She cried quietly at our kitchen table on Christmas night, and I sat with her and didn't try to fix it, didn't try to redirect or minimize or find the silver lining. Just sat with her the way I should have been sitting with her for years instead of spending that energy managing my father. When she stopped, she looked at me with her eyes very clear and said, "I didn't think you saw it." "I saw it," I told her. "I've always seen it. I just didn't know how to choose correctly until tonight." My phone started ringing at 9:30 that night. My mother first, then Karen, then my mother again. I looked at each call and made a decision that would have been unthinkable to me 24 hours earlier. I let them go to voicemail. All of them. The pull to answer was physical, something I felt in my chest and my hands, 31 years of conditioned response telling me that a ringing phone from my family in a moment of crisis was a summons I was obligated to answer. I sat with that pull, and I let it move through me without acting on it, the way you let a wave move through you when you stop fighting the water. Sarah watched me not answer and didn't say anything. But she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and that small gesture contained more understanding than I knew how to fully receive in that moment. I listened to the voicemails later, alone in the kitchen after Sarah had gone to bed. My mother's voice was the one that was hardest to hear. My mother's voicemail did not address what my father had done. Not once, not even indirectly, not even as a framing device for the rest of what she said. Instead, she told me that my father was upset, that the evening had ended badly, that she hoped Sarah wasn't too disturbed by what happened, and could I please call her back because she needed to know that everything was going to be all right. I stood in my kitchen at 10:15 on Christmas night, listening to my mother ask me to reassure her that everything was going to be all right, hours after my father had struck my wife across the face at her dinner table. And I understood, with a clarity that had perhaps always been available to me, but that I had never been quite ready to fully accept, that this was the central transaction of my family. The person who caused the damage was protected, the person who absorbed the damage was managed, and I was the mechanism through which that arrangement was maintained and called normal. I deleted the voicemail without saving it. Karen called again the next morning. I answered that one because Karen and I have always had something separate from the family dynamic, a private channel of honesty that neither of us fully extended to anyone else in the house on Maple Street. She drove to Denver years ago, and I have never once blamed her for it, and she has never once pretended that what she left behind wasn't real. "Are you okay?" she asked. "No," I said. It was the first time I had answered that question honestly in as long as I could remember. She was quiet for a moment. "How is Sarah?" "Physically fine," I said. "Everything else is going to take some time." Another pause. "What are you going to do?" she asked. And this was the question I had been sitting with since the night before, the question that had kept me awake beside Sarah for most of the night, the question that required me to decide, for the first time in my life, what I was actually willing to do when the mechanism my family relied on decided to stop operating on their schedule. "I don't know yet," I told Karen honestly, "but I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to call Dad and smooth it over. I'm not going to call Mom and reassure her that everything is fine. I'm not going to take the next family gathering and pretend Christmas didn't happen because it's easier for everyone if I do." Karen was quiet on the other end in a way that communicated things she wasn't saying the way we communicate in this family, in the spaces between words rather than in the words themselves. Then she said something that surprised me. "I've been waiting for this phone call for 8 years, she said. "I just didn't know if it would ever actually come." 8 years. She'd been watching this specific version of the situation for 8 years longer than I had apparently been willing to see it clearly. I thought about all the things she must have noticed from Denver, from the safe distance of 1,500 miles, that I had been too close and too embedded to allow myself to acknowledge. "Why didn't you say something?" I asked her. "Would you have heard it?" she said. She was right. I would not have heard it. That is the honest answer and the difficult one. And I have spent the weeks since Christmas sitting with it in a way I haven't been able to sit with difficult, honest things before, because for most of my life, the act of fixing and managing left no space for the kind of stillness that difficult, honest things require. I would not have heard Karen because hearing her would have required me to do something with what she said, and doing something would have meant disrupting the arrangement that my entire family, including me, had agreed to call normal. It is much easier to maintain a broken system than to dismantle it, especially when you are both the operator of the system and one of its primary products. I was a man who had been built by my family to serve a specific function within it, and that function had been so thoroughly integrated into my identity that stopping it felt, in those first days after Christmas, less like a choice I was making and more like a kind of ending I was surviving. My father called on December 27th. I had expected it sooner, which told me he'd spent 2 days either genuinely grappling with what he'd done or waiting for me to call first and absorb the situation back to normal the way I always had. The fact that he called at all was something, I suppose. Frank Mercer is not a man who makes phone calls to address things he has done wrong, primarily because the architecture of our family has never required him to. Why would you develop a skill the people around you have spent decades ensuring you never needed? I let it ring. I listened to the voicemail an hour later, standing in my kitchen with Sarah nearby, because I had made a decision the night before to stop listening to these voicemails alone. She had a right to hear what was said. She had been the one who was struck. If there was any accountability coming from my father, she deserved to be present for it. There was not much accountability in that voicemail. My father's voicemail lasted 43 seconds. I know because I listened to it 3 times. In those 43 seconds, he said that he was sorry the evening had gotten out of hand, that things had gotten heated, that he hoped Sarah wasn't holding on to any hard feelings, and that he wanted to know when we were planning to come over next because my mother missed us. There was no acknowledgement of what he'd specifically done, no recognition that his hand had made contact with my wife's face, no identification of his own action as the thing that had required apology. The apology was for the situation, the abstract, unattributed, nobody's fault situation, which is a specific kind of apology that contains within it the instruction to move forward without actually resolving anything. It was the apology of a man who had learned that offering the shape of accountability was often sufficient to restore the arrangement, because the people around him had always accepted the shape in place of the substance. I played it for Sarah. She listened without expression. When it finished, she said, "That's not an apology." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." I called my father back that evening. I had written nothing down, prepared no speech, rehearsed nothing, because I'd spent my entire life giving my father carefully managed versions of things, and I was finished doing that. I called him, and when he answered with the particular tone of a man who expects to receive something, I told him clearly and without escalation exactly what I needed him to understand. That what he did on Christmas was not something that could be resolved with a phone call about hard feelings. That striking my wife was not a moment that could be categorized as things getting out of hand, as if it were a weather event rather than a choice his hand made. That I was not going to be coming over until he called Sarah directly, used her name, identified specifically what he had done, and apologized for that specific thing without qualification or redirection. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said something that I will probably carry for the rest of my life. "You're choosing her over your own family," he said. The simplicity of it was almost breathtaking. 31 years of navigating this man's temper. 31 years of absorbing and managing and smoothing and fixing. 31 years of placing his comfort above my own instincts and my wife's dignity. And the moment I asked him to be accountable for a specific action directed at a specific person. The framework he reached for was that I was betraying my family by doing so. I sat with that sentence for a long time before responding. "Sarah is my family," I told him. "She has been my family for 11 years. And I have spent those 11 years choosing you over her in every moment that required choice." That stops now. He hung up, not dramatically, not with a slammed receiver. He simply ended the call, the way a man ends a conversation that has moved outside the boundaries he's willing to operate within. I sat with my phone in my hand and noticed something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Relief. My mother called the next morning. I answered because my mother is a different calculation than my father, has always been a different calculation, and the situation between us is more complicated in ways that I don't want to flatten into something simpler than it actually is. She is not an innocent party in the history of my family. She participated in the arrangement and benefited from it, and chose her own comfort over her children's clarity in more ways than I fully want to count. But she is also a woman who has spent 50 years married to Frank Mercer, and I understand in a way that I could not have understood before I was the age I am now, what that has done to her capacity for independent action. She called, and her voice was the voice of a woman operating under extreme stress, tight and careful in the way it gets when my father's moods have been making the house difficult. "Danny," she said, which is what she calls me when she needs something from me, "your father is very upset." I told her I understood that. I told her I was upset too, and that Sarah was upset, and that being upset was a reasonable response to what had happened at the Christmas dinner table 3 days earlier. She was quiet in the way she's quiet when she's trying to navigate between two things she can't easily reconcile. "He didn't mean it the way it came across," she said finally, which is the sentence she has been using my entire life to translate my father to the people he affects. The sentence that has functioned as the primary tool of his protection within our family for 5 decades. I used to accept that sentence. I used to take it and use it myself, passing it along to whoever needed it. My father's personal translator and damage control specialist available at all hours. "Mom," I said gently, "I need you to hear me say something, and I need you to actually hear it rather than immediately finding a way to make it smaller." She went very still on the phone the way she does when she knows something is coming that she doesn't want to receive. "He hit my wife," I said, "at the dinner table, in front of the family. I am not able to continue acting as though that is something that can be explained away or contextualized into a different shape. It happened, and until he calls Sarah and apologizes specifically for that specific thing, Sarah and I will not be coming to the house." The silence that followed was long. Not the silence of a woman processing something new. The silence of a woman who had been waiting to hear whether this particular moment was finally going to be the one that changed the arrangement. She had known this was possible. Some part of her had always known. "You know how he is," she said eventually, which was the most honest thing she said in that entire conversation, because it acknowledged that there was a how he is a consistent, known, navigable pattern, which meant that no one in that family had ever actually believed that things couldn't be helped framing. Knowing how someone is means knowing they're making choices. "Yes," I told her. "I don't know how he is." That's exactly the point. Sarah and I started seeing a therapist in January together. It was Sarah's suggestion, offered without pressure, framed as something that might help us process everything rather than something required to repair damage between us. Our marriage was not damaged. If anything, the weeks after Christmas had produced a clarity and closeness between us that I hadn't fully realized we'd been missing. The specific intimacy that arrives when two people finally stop managing around something and begin simply being honest about it together. The therapy was less about our marriage and more about the 31 years I'd spent in a role I'd never chosen and never questioned and had paid for in ways I was only beginning to understand. Our therapist, a calm and direct woman named Dr. Okafor, asked me in our second session to describe what I felt when my family needed something from me. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "Obligated," I said, and afraid of what happens if I don't respond. She nodded and wrote something down. "Whose fear is that?" she asked. I didn't have an immediate answer. January passed without contact from my father. My mother called twice, both times conversations that circled the actual situation without landing on it. Both times ending with her saying she hoped things would settle down soon, which was the family's way of expressing hope that I would return to my previous function without requiring anything to actually change. I didn't return. I also didn't escalate, didn't issue ultimatums beyond the one I'd already stated clearly, didn't engage in the extended negotiation my family seemed to be waiting for me to initiate. I simply stayed where I was, which for the mechanism I had always been was perhaps the most radical thing I could have done. Karen called regularly, real calls, the kind we should have been having for years. She told me about her own process of separating from the family dynamic after she moved to Denver, the guilt that had accompanied it, the way that guilt had slowly transformed into something she could actually live inside once she'd put enough distance and honesty between herself and the house on Maple Street. "The guilt doesn't go away," Karen told me one evening in late January, "but it changes shape. It stops being about whether you're doing the right thing and starts being about grieving the family you needed them to be and they never were." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Grieving the family you needed them to be. I had never thought about what I was doing in those terms, had never given myself permission to grieve anything in relation to my family, because grieving required acknowledging loss, and acknowledging loss required admitting that something had been wrong. I had spent 31 years being the person who kept the lid on the acknowledgement of wrongness so that the family could continue operating in its preferred version of itself. Taking the lid off meant sitting with everything that had been underneath it, and there was more underneath it than I had been prepared for. Sarah found me one night sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with my hands flat on the table and nothing in front of me, and she sat down across from me without asking questions and just stayed there until I was ready to come back to bed. In February, my father called again. I almost didn't answer. My hand was on the phone, and the pull to decline was strong. Not out of anger, but out of self-protection, the new instinct I was slowly developing to replace the old one. I answered because Dr. Okafor and I had talked about the difference between avoidance and boundaries, and I understood that not speaking to my father indefinitely was only useful if I was clear about what I was waiting for rather than simply waiting for the discomfort to become familiar enough to call resolution. He sounded older than I expected. Not physically different, but something in his voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, something that might have been uncertainty, which was so unfamiliar on Frank Mercer that I almost didn't recognize it. "I want to talk," he said, "not to smooth something over, not with the architecture of an explanation already built and waiting to be delivered." He said it the way a person says it when they mean it. "Okay," I said, "I am listening." What my father said in that phone call was not a perfect apology. I want to be honest about that, because this story doesn't deserve a version of events that's cleaner than what actually happened. It was not the clear, specific, unqualified acknowledgement I had told him I needed. It had qualifications in it. It had context I hadn't asked for. It had the defensive architecture of a man who had never in his life been required to fully dismantle his own justifications for the way he behaved, attempting to partially dismantle them while keeping the structure mostly intact. But inside all of that, somewhere in the middle of a long and uncomfortable phone call, my father said something that I had genuinely never expected to hear from him in my lifetime. "I know I haven't been easy," he said. "I know what it cost you to be the one who managed everything. I know that wasn't fair to put on you." I held the phone and didn't say anything for a long moment. It wasn't an apology for Christmas, but it was something I hadn't known I needed to hear until he said it. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I told him I meant it. And then I told him that appreciating it and considering it sufficient were two different things, and that the conversation we still needed to have was the one where he called Sarah and spoke to her directly about what had happened at Christmas. He was quiet. "She probably doesn't want to hear from me," he said. "That's her decision to make," I told him. "Not yours." Another long silence. My father is a man who has operated his entire life from the assumption that he already knows what the people around him want and need, which has allowed him to preemptively excuse himself from the effort of actually finding out. Watching him sit with the removal of that assumption, even over the phone, even partially, was one of the stranger experiences of that winter. "I don't know what to say to her," he admitted. The admission itself was something. Frank Mercer does not readily acknowledge not knowing how to do things. "Tell her the truth," I said. "That's all she needs." He called Sarah on a Thursday afternoon in late February. She told me about it that evening after I got home from work, sitting at the kitchen table the way we've sat at that table for most of the significant conversations of our marriage. She said it had been short, uncomfortable, and genuine in the unpolished way that genuine things often are when they come from people who have very little practice at them. He had used her name. He had said specifically that he had no excuse for what he did at Christmas. He had said he was sorry, directly, without routing the apology through the situation or the evening or the way things had gotten. He had not asked for forgiveness or an immediate restoration of things to normal. He had said what he said and then gone quiet and waited, which was the most restrained and respectful thing my father had done in any interaction I was aware of in 31 years. Sarah had thanked him for calling. She hadn't told him everything was fine because it wasn't yet, but she'd thanked him for calling, and she said she'd meant it. I want to tell you something about what happened in our marriage in the months after Christmas, because this story is not only about my father, and it would be dishonest to tell it as though it were. Something opened between Sarah and me that I think had been waiting to open for most of our 11 years together, something that required exactly this crisis and exactly this choice to finally crack the surface. I had spent 11 years being a good husband in most of the ways that are visible and countable, present, reliable, loving in the practical and consistent ways I knew how to be loving. What I had not been was fully honest with her about the cost of what I was managing, fully present in the moments when my family required me to split my attention, fully available in the emotional sense that requires a person to stop performing competence and simply be in need of something for once. The months after Christmas were the first time in our marriage that I stopped performing competence with Sarah and simply needed her. She was extraordinarily good at being needed. In March, we went to visit Karen in Denver, just Sarah and I. No occasion, no reason beyond wanting to be somewhere that felt uncomplicated and honest. Karen's house is warm in the way that houses become warm when the people inside them have done the work of being honest with themselves and each other. A warmth that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absence of things being carefully managed below the surface. We spent 4 days there, long dinners and longer conversations, Karen telling me things about her childhood that she'd observed from her position as the older sibling, things that reframed events I'd been carrying a certain way for decades. Mike, her husband, is the kind of man who understands when to be present and when to give people room, and he moved through those 4 days with a grace that I found myself grateful for every day. On the last night, Karen and I stayed up until 2 in the morning talking about our parents the way we should have been talking about them for years, without protection or management, just the plain version of what we each knew. "Do you remember the summer I was 16? Karen asked me that last night, both of us at her kitchen table with tea going cold between us. I told her I remembered that summer generally, the way you remember a year rather than its specific contents. Dad and Mom fought for 3 weeks straight, she said. Every night. I used to hear it through the wall. I nodded. I remembered the sound of it, the specific quality of voices in conflict traveling through walls in the night. You used to come into my room, she said. Do you remember that? I didn't actually. You were 12, she said, and you'd sit on the edge of my bed and tell me jokes until I fell asleep. Every night for 3 weeks. I sat with that image of a 12-year-old version of myself, sitting on his sister's bed telling jokes while his parents fought through the wall, and I understood something about the origin of the mechanism that I hadn't been able to see from the inside of it. I had started fixing things before I was old enough to know that what I was fixing wasn't mine to carry. We came home from Denver different in a way that was hard to articulate and easy to feel. Not fixed, not resolved, not in possession of any answers we hadn't had before, but lighter, the specific lightness of people who have spent several days being fully honest and have found that the honesty, as frightening as it had seemed from the outside, was actually easier to live inside than the alternative. I went back to therapy with a different quality of openness than I'd brought before Denver, able to access things that had previously required more excavation. Dr. Okafor noticed the difference. Something shifted, she said in our first session back. Yes, I told her. I think I finally understand where it started. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, she said, and I told her about a 12-year-old boy sitting on his sister's bed telling jokes through 3 weeks of parental conflict and the 32 years of professional-grade conflict management that boy had built on top of that foundation. April brought an unexpected development. My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if she could come see me alone, without my father, something she had not done in my adult memory. My parents operate as a unit in their external presentations. They arrive together, leave together, and whatever my mother privately thinks is routed through the filter of my father's presence before it reaches the outside world. A request to come alone was significant enough that I mentioned it to Sarah before calling my mother back. Not to get permission, but because our marriage since Christmas had become a place where I brought things rather than managed them privately. Sarah said she thought I should say yes. I called my mother back and told her she could come on Saturday. She arrived with a coffee cake she'd baked herself, the specific one she used to make when we were children, and something needed to be made better, and I understood from the coffee cake alone that this visit had been weighing on her for longer than the phone call. My mother sat at my kitchen table, and for the first 20 minutes we talked about nothing. The neighbors, the weather, a show she'd been watching. I let her take the time she needed, because this was not a woman practiced at arriving at difficult things directly, and pushing her toward it before she was ready would have simply closed the door. Sarah brought coffee and sat with us briefly, and then quietly excused herself, understanding instinctively what the visit required, which is one of the 1,000 things I love about her. Eventually, my mother put both hands around her coffee cup the way she does when she's steadying herself for something, and she looked at me and said, I should have done more. Not I'm sorry the evening got difficult. Not your father didn't mean it the way it came across. I should have done more. 5 words that contained 50 years of marriage and 31 years of a family arrangement, and every Christmas and birthday and Sunday dinner where something happened that she translated rather than addressed. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. We talked for 2 hours, my mother and I, the longest honest conversation we had ever had in my life, at a table where Sarah had quietly left coffee and coffee cake and the space for it to happen. My mother talked about things I hadn't known. The specific shape of her own navigation inside her marriage. The calculations she'd made across 50 years about what was possible to address and what was safer to manage. The fear that had lived beneath her choices, and that she had called practicality because calling it fear was too honest to sustain. She wasn't asking me to excuse her. She was clear about that, actually clearer than I expected her to be about the distinction. I'm not telling you this so you'll understand why it was okay, she said. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth about what you grew up inside, and I should have told you a long time ago. She cried once, briefly, then stopped herself in the way she always has the habit of 50 years. I let her take the tissue from her own pocket and didn't rush to fill the moment with comfort. Some moments need their full weight. My father came to our house for the first time in April, 2 days after my mother's visit. He came alone, which was the only condition I put on it, not because I wanted to isolate him, but because there are conversations that require the absence of an audience to be real. He stood in our living room with his coat still on for a moment, looking at the room the way people look at a space they've imagined differently than it actually appears. Frank Mercer is a large man who takes up a lot of physical and atmospheric space in most rooms. In our living room on that April afternoon, he looked, for the first time I could remember, like someone uncertain of his dimensions. Sarah came in and said hello with a steadiness that I knew cost her something and that I was profoundly grateful for, and then she excused herself the same way she had with my mother, giving us the room and the silence and the 31 years of accumulated things that needed to finally exist in the open air between my father and me. I will not tell you that my father became a different man in our living room that afternoon. That would not be the truth, and this story has earned the truth by now. He is 71 years old, and people do not fundamentally restructure at 71, and expecting that would be its own kind of unfairness. What I will tell you is that he sat across from me, and he did not perform. He did not arrive with an architecture of explanation already assembled. He sat in the chair across from me, in his coat for the first 15 minutes, because he kept forgetting he was still wearing it, and when I pointed it out, he looked down at himself like a man who genuinely lost track of basic logistics, which told me more about where he was internally than anything he said. What he said was incomplete and imperfect and punctuated with silences that were sometimes the right kind and sometimes the kind that meant he'd hit the edge of his available vocabulary for things he'd never been required to say out loud. But he said them incompletely and imperfectly, and I listened to all of it. He asked me at one point whether I had always felt the way I described on our February phone call, obligated, afraid of what happened if I didn't respond. I told him yes, for as long as I could remember. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't know that, he said, and I believe him, which is the complicated part. I believe my father genuinely did not know, not because the information was unavailable to him, but because the information had never been presented to him in a way he was required to receive, because I had spent 31 years ensuring it wasn't. The mechanism protected him from knowing what the mechanism cost. I had done it so thoroughly and so consistently that the person most harmed by his ignorance of its cost was me, and the person most responsible for maintaining that ignorance was also me. Dr. Okafor had walked me to this understanding over several months of sessions, and I had arrived at it intellectually, but sitting across from my father and watching him genuinely absorb it in real time gave it a weight that no therapy session had fully produced. He left after 2 hours. At the door he turned and looked at me with an expression I don't have a clean word for, something assembled from components that don't usually appear together on Frank Mercer's face, regret and uncertainty and something almost like respect. He shook my hand, which is what he does instead of hugging, because he has never been comfortable with hugging, and I shook it back, and he left. Sarah appeared in the hallway almost immediately after the door closed, reading my face the way she's been reading it for 11 years. "How are you?" she asked. I thought about it honestly, which is what I do now instead of giving the automatic answer. "Sad," I said, "but the right kind of sad. The kind that's about something real instead of something avoided." She came and stood beside me, and we looked out the window of my father's car, pulling away from the curb. "The right kind of sad is a good sign," she said. "I know," I told her, and I did. We had dinner at my parents' house in May, Sarah and I, the first time since Christmas. I want to describe it accurately because the accurate description is more useful than the comfortable one. It was not a transformed evening. My father was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that was clearly effortful rather than natural, the quiet of a man consciously managing something rather than simply being at ease. My mother was anxious in the particular way she's anxious when she's monitoring too many things simultaneously. Sarah was steady in the extraordinary way she's been steady through this entire year. I sat at that table in the house where I grew up, and I felt, for the first time in my memory, present in it as myself rather than as the function I'd been built to perform inside it. No redirects required. No temperature monitoring. No exits prepared. Just a dinner, imperfect and uncomfortable in certain moments and warm in others, with a specific texture of something that was genuinely beginning rather than being carefully maintained. My father did not strike anyone at that dinner. I say this not as a low bar cleared, but because I want to be honest about what I was watching for and what I observed. He made one comment across the evening that had the old edge in it, something dismissive directed at something Sarah said. And I watched myself in the moment of it. Watched the old mechanism start to activate, the redirect already forming in my mouth, and I let it pass without deploying it. Instead, I looked at Sarah, and she looked at me, and then she responded to my father directly, calmly, holding her own ground without escalation, and my father received it with a brief silence, and then moved past it without amplification. It was small. It was also enormous. The entire architecture of the evening had been different because I had not been operating as its load-bearing wall, and the ceiling had not fallen. Things had simply been what they were, without management, and what they were had been survivable. I think about that 12-year-old boy on his sister's bed a lot. I think about what he deserved, which was to be 12 years old on his sister's bed telling jokes because he wanted to make her laugh, not because the house required him to manage something he had no capacity or responsibility to manage. I think about what it built in him, that early and thorough training in the suppression of his own needs in service of the room's equilibrium. I think about all the rooms he subsequently walked into across 31 years, reading their temperatures, preparing their exits, smoothing their edges, absorbing their costs. I think about the woman who married him and spent 11 years trying to show him the reflection of something she could see clearly that he kept finding ways not to look at directly. I think about a Christmas dinner table and a hand moving faster than thought, and a silence that was also in the specific way that some terrible things are a door opening. I think about all of it with the kind of gratitude that only arrives through things that hurt. Sarah, and I talk about having children again. Not in the urgent or heavy way we talked about it before the miscarriages, not with the weight of loss making every conversation about it difficult to fully breathe inside. We talk about it the way people talk about things they genuinely want and are genuinely uncertain about, and have genuinely made peace with the uncertainty of openly, without the management of each other's potential disappointment, without the careful framing of people protecting each other from their own feelings. It is one of the most significant changes in our marriage, this ability to simply be honest about wanting things without immediately constructing the architecture of its potential failure. I know where I learned to pre-manage disappointment before it arrived. I know what it cost me. I know I am done passing it forward. Karen is coming to Cincinnati for Thanksgiving this year, the first time she's come back for a family holiday in 4 years. She told me she felt ready, partly because of the conversations we've been having, partly because of what she describes as the change she can hear in my voice when I talk about my parents now. Less managed, less careful, more like someone reporting what they actually observe rather than translating it into a version designed for comfortable receipt. Mike is coming with her. Sarah is making the turkey. My mother called last week to ask if she could bring her coffee cake, the same one she brought to my kitchen in April, and I told her yes, and she sounded lighter than she has in a long time. My father and I have not reached anything I would call fully repaired, but we are in something I would call honest, which is the ground that repair actually requires, and which we have never previously stood on together. Dr. Okafor asked me in a recent session what I would tell the 12-year-old version of myself, if I could. I sat with it longer than she probably expected before answering, because it deserved a real answer rather than a quick one. I'd tell him my jokes are good, I said eventually. Karen loves them, and they're helping her through a hard thing, and that's real, and it matters. But I'd tell him that fixing the room isn't his job, that the room was broken before he got there, and it'll still be broken after he leaves, and that the only thing he's actually responsible for is himself. Dr. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Could you have heard that? She asked. No, I said. Not then. Another pause. Can you hear it now? She asked. I looked at her and thought about Sarah at our kitchen table on Christmas night with her hand against her cheek. I thought about the phone calls I didn't answer. I thought about the door I walked back through and the one I chose not to. Yes, I told her. I think I finally can. There's a version of this story where I tell you that my father is transformed, my family is healed, and 31 years of a broken arrangement has been replaced by something whole and uncomplicated. That version would be easier to tell and easier to receive and would be a lie. The true version is this. My father is 71 years old and working imperfectly and inconsistently at something he has never been asked to work at before. My mother is finding, slowly, a voice she has been managing around for 50 years. My wife and I have built something in the aftermath of one terrible Christmas that is more honest and more durable than what we had before it. And I am learning, one ordinary day at a time, how to be in a room without being responsible for it. That is the whole of it, not a resolution, a beginning arrived at through the worst possible door, carrying exactly the things that worst possible doors always carry alongside their damage. If this story found you in the middle of something you've been managing alone for too long, I hope it reminds you that the room was not yours to fix. It never was, and it is not too late to put down.